Rabindranath Tagore's essay Nationalism, written over 100 years ago, helps us understand the world today. It is one of those great essays from the burning archive of world literature and history that helps us live in tune with changing times. And I'm going to read that essay to you today and introduce you to the key ideas of this great essay by the winner of the 1913 Nobel Prize for Literature. I'm Jeff Rich. Welcome to the Burning Archive, where I share treasures from history and world culture, world literature, for you to try to live in tune with the changing world. Tagore's essay speaks to us today because it was written at a time when the future and freedom seemed to lie in the nation state. It was written in 1917 in the depths of World War I, as a number of empires, the British Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire started to fall apart, and after 1919 the world would be reassembled along the principle of the nation state. But it is the idea of the nation that Tagore criticises in this great essay, and in doing so, I guess he offers us an imaginative alternative way of thinking that we can perhaps take up ourselves today. The idea of the nation, specifically the nation state, still dominates theories and discussion of international politics, even while it is much less influential in the writing of history and much less influential than it was in the early 20th century in terms of people's perception of the national character of culture, the specific, almost racial attributes of a nation. Yet today, especially in the world of politics, debates still rage about nationalism, the idea of national interests of nationalists versus globalists. Some people feel nationalism is a bad thing, and some people feel it is a good thing. Those who think it is a bad thing have the entire history of the 20th century perhaps to point to some of its problems, but those who think nationalism is a good thing can also see much good in that history as well. But some people will often oppose today the idea of nationalist versus globalists, where nationalists, I guess, are often seen as right-wing people who are defending the interests of their country against what they perceive as a kind of a transnational elite, arguably perhaps not so different to the transnational elites of the European colonial empires that Rabindranath Tagore was writing about back in 1917. And at that time, in 1917, many people felt that the fate of people in India, in Japan, in all of the powers dominated by European empires really rested in them espousing the idea of the nation, of pursuing a path of national liberation, of national independence. And that was very much, I guess, the path that was almost officially endorsed through the League of Nations, through Woodrow Wilson, and through the peace conference at Versailles in 1919. But it was not the path that this great Indian independent thinker Rabindranath Tagore advocated. And I think in doing so, he offers us today something of an example, a model of a way to approach thinking about the possibilities of our sort of shared public life in different ways, not so hidebound by concepts like the idea of the nation that have a very, very mixed history. I think before I read the essay, there are three important points I just want to make so that you can understand the context of this essay well, partly about the biography of Rabindranath Tagore, partly about the key ideas of the essay, and thirdly, the context of the debate in which his essay is being discussed. So it's important to note that Rabindranath Tagore, although he opposed the idea of nationalism, was certainly no advocate of British Empire or colonialism. In fact, he was deeply opposed to it. He was a leader of Indian nationalism and a key opponent of colonial rule. But he did not take the path of national independence, and over the period from about 1905 to 1917, he distanced himself from many of the people who were pursuing either violent courses of national liberation or who were sort of reverting, I guess, to very traditional ideas about what the nature of Indian civilization and culture was. And he remained a very influential thinker on the founders of the Indian Republic after 1947, and so is often recognised as one of the leading founders of the independent Indian state. So this is a very important and influential thinker who is making this contribution about nationalism. The ideas in the essay are very much criticisms of the idea of the nation state. And broadly, he makes three broad criticisms of the idea of the nation state. One is that he often compares the nation to a machine. It's a kind of a mechanical view of human life that is all about production and power and not about the more humane, cultured aspects of human life, of altruism, of the very best of humanity. Secondly, he criticises the nation state as very much about competition between nations rather than cooperation between peoples. And then thirdly, he associates the idea of the nation with conquest, and therefore also very much sees the idea of the nation as the idea of the West, of the idea of the colonial powers. He says, if that is their idea, then are we really liberating ourselves by adopting their idea rather than something more rooted in our own better cultural roots? And you can hear this idea from the very first sentence of the essay, Nationalism in the West, that I'm about to read to you. So he says there, the truth is that the spirit of conflict versus cooperation and conquest is at the origin and in the centre of Western nationalism. Its basis is not social cooperation. So that first sentence sets out the key ideas of Tagore, and you'll be very interested to hear what follows. Then finally, the context of this debate. Now, this essay that I'm going to read, Nationalism in the West, is one of 3 essays that were originally delivered as lectures by Tagore. One was Nationalism in India, which addressed the kind of internal debates within India about how to go with anti-colonial powers. Second is Nationalism in Japan, looked at how Japan was adopting the idea of the nation through the sort of Meiji Restoration period and its self-strengthening. But in Tagore's view, disastrously mimicking some of the worst aspects of Western culture. And then finally, he discusses nationalism in the West, where he zones in on how this Euro-Atlantic idea of nation has been has had such a disastrous impact on the world. And he's critical, I guess, of how the Indian nationalists become monsters hunting monsters. They turn, I think, to he uses the term hooliganism to describe them. And similarly, he's critical of how Japanese nationalists lose some of their deeper spiritual values in copying the West. And indeed, Tagore's ideas are part of a big debate in the first half of the 20th century of alternatives to nation or empire. There had been all these colonial empires in the 19th century, including America's colonial empire, Philippines and Cuba and so on. And there were emerging nationalist movements around the world, including within the European empire's home bases themselves in the 19th century. They were all rising to a crescendo. And you could even say that that storm was what created the conditions for World War I. Through the 1920s and 1930s and through Tagore's essay itself, there was a big debate as to whether there was a way to organise international relations in a different way, a more cooperative way, and whether there were alternatives to the nation state. And in my Wednesday essay on Substack this week, I'm going to be looking a little bit more closely at a wonderful recent essay by the historian Priya Satia on this idea itself, that really picks up from the ideas of Tagore's nationalism and the early thinking of Nehru, who became Prime Minister of India. So please enjoy this reading of Tagore's Nationalism in the West. And after I finish reading the essay, I'll appear back again on camera and I'll share with you a tribute to Tagore from one of the great political philosophers of the 20th century who wrote widely on the problems of nationalism in the 20th century, and that is Isaiah Berlin. Please enjoy and make sure you join me at the end of the video. Rabindranath Tagore, Nationalism in the West, from his book Nationalism, based on a series of lectures delivered in Japan in 1917. The truth is that the spirit of conflict and conquest is at the origin and in the centre of the Western nationalism. Its basis is not social cooperation. It has evolved a perfect organisation of power, but not spiritual idealism. It is like the pack of predatory creatures that must have its victims. With all its heart, it cannot bear to see its hunting grounds converted into cultivated fields. In fact, these nations are fighting among themselves for the extension of their victims and their reserve forests. Therefore, the Western nations act like a dam to check the free flow of the Western civilization into the country of the no nation. Because this civilization is the civilization of power. Therefore, it is exclusive. It is naturally unwilling to open its sources of power to those whom it has selected for the purposes of exploitation. But all the same, a moral law is the law of humanity, and the exclusive civilization which thrives upon others who are barred from its benefit carries its own death sentence in its moral limitations. The slavery that it gives rise to unconsciously drains its own love of freedom dry. The helplessness with which it weighs down its world of victims exerts its force of gravitation every moment upon the power that creates it. And the greater part of the world which has been denuded of its self-sustaining life by the nation will one day become the most terrible of all its burdens, ready to drag it down into the bottom of destruction. Whenever power removes all checks from its path to make its career easy, it triumphantly rides into its ultimate crash of death. Its moral brake becomes slacker every day without its knowing it, and its slippery path of ease becomes its path of doom. Of all things in Western civilization, those which this Western nation has given us in a most generous measure are law and order. While the small feeding bottle of our education is nearly dry and sanitation sucks its own thumb in despair, the military organisation, the magisterial officers, the police, the criminal investigation department, the secret spy system attain to an abnormal girth in their waists, occupying every inch of our country. This is to maintain order. But is not this order merely a negative good? Is it not for giving people's life greater opportunities for the freedom of development? Its perfection is the perfection of an eggshell whose true value lies in the security it affords to the chick and its nourishment, and not in the convenience it offers to the person at the breakfast table. Mere administration is unproductive. It is not creative, not being a living thing. It is a steamroller, formidable in its weight and power, having its uses, but it does not help the soil to become fertile. When, after its enormous toil, it comes to offer us its boon of peace, we can but murmur under our breath that peace is good, but not more so than life, which is God's own great boon. On the other hand, our former governments were woefully lacking in many of the advantages of the modern government. But because those were not the governments by the nation, their texture was loosely woven, leaving big gaps through which our own life sent its threads and imposed its designs. I am quite sure in those days we had things that were extremely distasteful to us, but we know that when we walk barefooted upon a ground strewn with gravel, gradually our feet come to adjust themselves to the caprices of the inhospitable earth. While if the tiniest particle of a gravel finds its lodgment inside our shoes, we can never forget and forgive its intrusion. And these shoes are the government by the nation. It is tight. It regulates our steps with a closed-up system, within which our feet have only the slightest liberty to make their own adjustments. Therefore, when you produce your statistics to compare the number of gravels which our feet had to encounter in former days with the paucity in the present regime, they hardly touch the real points. It is not the numerousness of the outside obstacles, but the comparative powerlessness of the individual to cope with them. This narrowness of freedom is an evil which is more radical, not because of its quantity, but because of its nature. And we cannot but acknowledge this paradox, that while the spirit of the West marches under its banner of freedom, the nation of the West forges its iron chains of organisation, which are the most relentless and unbreakable that have ever been manufactured in the whole history of man. When the humanity of India was not under the government of the organisation, the elasticity of change was great enough to encourage men of power and spirit to feel that they had their destinies in their own hands. The hope of the unexpected was never absent, and a freer play of imagination, both on the part of the governor and the governed, had its effect in the making of history. We were not confronted with a future which was a dead white wall of granite blocks eternally guarding against the expression and extension of our own powers, the hopelessness of which lies in the reason that these powers are becoming atrophied at their very roots by the scientific process of paralysis. For every single individual in the country of the no nation is completely in the grip of a whole nation whose tireless vigilance, being the vigilance of a machine, has not the human power to overlook or to discriminate. At the least pressing of its button, the monster organisation becomes all eyes, whose ugly stare of inquisitiveness cannot be avoided by a single person amongst the immense multitude of the ruled. At the least turn of its screw by the fraction of an inch, the grip is tightened to the point of suffocation around every man, woman and child of a vast population for whom no escape is imaginable in their own country, or even in any country outside their own. It is the continual and stupendous dead pressure of this inhuman upon the living human under which the modern world is groaning. Not merely the subject races, but you who live under the delusion that you are free, are every day sacrificing your freedom and humanity to this fetish of nationalism, living in the dense, poisonous atmosphere of worldwide suspicion and greed and panic. I have seen in Japan the voluntary submission of the whole people to the trimming of their minds and clipping of their freedom by their government, which through various educational agencies regulates their thoughts, manufactures their feelings, becomes suspiciously watchful when they show signs of inclining toward the spiritual, leading them through a narrow path not toward what is true, but what is necessary for the complete welding of them into one uniform mass according to its own recipe. The people accept this all-pervading mental slavery with cheerfulness and pride because of their nervous desire to turn themselves into a machine of power called the nation, and emulate other machines in their collective worldliness. When questioned as to the wisdom of its course, the newly converted fanatic of nationalism answers that so long as nations are rampant in this world, we have not the option freely to develop our higher humanity. We must utilize every faculty that we possess to resist the evil by assuming it ourselves in the fullest degree. For the only brotherhood possible in the modern world is the brotherhood of hooliganism. The recognition of the fraternal bond of love between Japan and Russia, which has lately been celebrated with an immense display of rejoicing in Japan, was not owing to any sudden recrudescence of the spirit of Christianity or of Buddhism, but it was a bond established according to the modern faith in a surer relationship of mutual menace of blood shedding. Yes, one cannot but acknowledge that these facts are the facts of the world of the nation, and the only moral of it is that all the peoples of the earth should strain their physical, moral, and intellectual resources to the utmost to defeat one another in the wrestling match of powerfulness. In the ancient days, Sparta paid all her attention to becoming powerful, and she did become so by crippling her humanity, and she died of the amputation. But it is no consolation to us to know that the weakening of humanity from which the present age is suffering is not limited to the subject races, and that its ravages are even more radical, because insidious and voluntary, in peoples who are hypnotized into believing that they are free. This bartering of your higher aspirations of life for profit and power has been your own free choice, and I leave you there at the wreckage of your soul, contemplating your protuberant prosperity. But will you never be called to answer for organising the instincts of self-aggrandizement of whole peoples into perfection and calling it good? I ask you, what disaster has there ever been in the history of man in its darkest period like this terrible disaster of the nation, fixing its fangs deep into the naked flesh of the world, taking permanent precautions against its natural relaxation? You, the people of the West, who have manufactured this abnormality, can you imagine the desolating despair of this haunted world of suffering man possessed by the ghastly abstraction of the organising man? Can you put yourself into the position of the peoples who seem to have been doomed into an eternal damnation of their own humanity, who not only must suffer continual curtailment of their manhood, but even raise their voices in paeans of praise for the benignity of a mechanical apparatus in its interminable parody of providence? Have you not seen, since the commencement of the existence of the nation, that the dread of it has been the one goblin dread with which the whole world has been trembling? Wherever there is a dark corner, there is the suspicion of its secret malevolence, and people live in a perpetual distrust of its back where it has no eyes. Every sound of footstep, every rustle of movement in the neighbourhood sends a thrill of terror all around, and this terror is the parent of all that is base in man's nature. It makes one almost openly unashamed of inhumanity. Clever lies become matters of self-congratulation. Solemn pledges become a farce, laughable for their very solemnity. The nation, with all its paraphernalia of power and prosperity, its flags and pious hymns, its blasphemous prayers in the churches, and the literary mock thunders of its patriotic bragging, cannot hide the fact that the nation is the greatest evil for the nation, that all its precautions are against it, and any new birth of its fellow in the world is always followed in its mind by the dread of a new peril. Its one wish is to trade on the feebleness of the rest of the world, like some insects that are bred in the paralysed flesh of victims kept just enough alive to make them toothsome and nutritious. Therefore, it is ready to send its poisonous fluid into the vitals of the other living peoples who not being nations are harmless. For this the nation has had and still has its richest pasture in Asia. Great China, rich with her ancient wisdom and social ethics, her discipline of industry and self-control, is like a whale awakening the lust of spoil in the heart of the nation. She is already carrying in her quivering flesh harpoons sent by the unerring aim of the nation, the creature of science and selfishness. Her pitiful attempt to shake off her traditions of humanity, her social ideals, and spend her last exhausted resources to drill herself into modern efficiency is thwarted at every step by the nation. It is tightening its financial ropes round her, trying to drag her up on the shore and cut her into pieces, and then go and offer public thanksgiving to God for supporting the one existing evil and shattering the possibility of a new one. And for all this, the nation has been claiming the gratitude of history and all eternity for its exploitation, ordering its band of praise to be struck up from end to end of the world, declaring itself to be the salt of the earth, the flower of humanity, the blessing of God, hurled with all his force upon the naked skulls of the world of no nations. I know what your advice will be. You will say, form yourselves into a nation and resist this encroachment of the nation. But is this the true advice, that of a man to a man? Why should this be a necessity? I could well believe you if you had said, be more good, more just, more true in your relation to man. Control your greed. Make your life wholesome in its simplicity, and let your consciousness of the divine in humanity be more perfect in its expression. But must you say that it is not the soul, but the machine, which is of the utmost value to ourselves, and that man's salvation depends upon his disciplining himself into a perfection of the dead rhythm of wheels and counterwheels? That machine must be pitted against machine and nation against nation in an endless bullfight of politics. You say these machines will come into an agreement for their mutual protection based upon a conspiracy of fear. But will this federation of steam boilers supply you with a soul which has her conscience and her God? What is to happen to that larger part of the world, where fear will have had no hand in restraining you? Whatever safety they now enjoy, those countries of no nation, from the unbridled license of forge and hammer and turn screw, results from the mutual jealousy of the powers. But when instead of being numerous separate machines, they become riveted into one organised gregariousness of gluttony, commercial and political, what remotest chance of hope will remain for those others who have lived and suffered, have loved and worshipped, have thought deeply and worked with meekness, but whose only crime has been that they have not organised? But, you say, that does not matter. The unfit must go to the wall. They shall die, and this is science. No, for the sake of your own salvation, I say they shall live, and this is truth. It is extremely bold of me to say so, but I assert that man's world is a moral world, not because we blindly agree to believe it, but because it is so in truth, which would be dangerous for us to ignore. And this moral nature of man cannot be divided into convenient compartments for its preservation. You cannot secure it for your home consumption with protective tariff walls while in foreign parts, making it enormously accommodating in its free trade of license. Has not this truth already come home to you now, when this cruel war has driven its claws into the vitals of Europe, when her hoard of wealth is bursting into smoke, and her humanity is shattered into bits on her battlefields? You ask in amazement, what has she done to deserve this? The answer is that the West has been systematically petrifying her moral nature in order to lay a solid foundation for her gigantic abstractions of efficiency. She has all along been starving the life of the personal man into that of the professional. Thus, man, with his mental and material power far outgrowing his moral strength, is like an exaggerated giraffe whose head has suddenly shot up miles away from the rest of him, making normal communication difficult to establish. This greedy head, with its huge dental organisation, has been munching all the topmost foliage of the world, but the nourishment is too late in reaching his digestive organs, and his heart is suffering from want of blood. Of this present disharmony in man's nature, the West seems to have been blissfully unconscious. The enormity of its material success has diverted all its attention towards self-congratulation on its bulk. The optimism of its logic goes on basing the calculations of its good fortune upon the indefinite prolongation of its railway lines toward eternity. It is superficial enough to think that all tomorrows are merely todays with the repeated additions of 24 hours. It has no fear of the chasm which is opening wider every day between man's ever-growing storehouses and the emptiness of his hungry humanity. Logic does not know that, under the lowest bed of endless strata of wealth and comforts, earthquakes are being hatched to restore the balance of the moral world, and one day the gaping gulf of spiritual vacuity will draw into its bottom the store of things that have their eternal love for the dust. Man in his fullness is not powerful but perfect. Therefore, to turn him into mere power, you have to curtail his soul as much as possible. When we are fully human, we cannot fly at one another's throats. Our instincts of social life, our traditions of moral ideals stand in the way. If you want me to take to butchering human beings, you must break up that wholeness of my humanity through some discipline which makes my will dead, my thoughts numb, my movements automatic. And then from the dissolution of the complex personal man will come out that abstraction, that destructive force, which has no relation to human truth and therefore can be easily brutal or mechanical. Take away man from his natural surroundings, from the fullness of his communal life with all its living associations of beauty and love and social obligations, and you will be able to turn him into so many fragments of a machine for the production of wealth on a gigantic scale. Turn a tree and into a log, and it will burn for you, but it will never bear living flowers and fruit. This process of dehumanizing has been going on in commerce and politics, and out of the long birth throes of mechanical energy has been born this fully developed apparatus of magnificent power and surprising appetite, which has been christened in the West as the nation. As I have hinted before, because of its quality of abstraction, it has, with the greatest ease, gone far ahead of the complete moral man, and having the conscience of a ghost and the callous perfection of an automaton, it is causing disasters of which the volcanic dissipations of the youthful moon would be ashamed to be brought into comparison. As a result, the suspicion of man for man stings all the limbs of this civilization like the hairs of the nettle. Each country is casting its net of espionage into the slimy bottom of the others, fishing for their secrets, the treacherous secrets brewing in the oozy depths of diplomacy. And what is their secret service but the nation's underground trade in kidnapping, murder and treachery, and all the ugly crimes bred in the depth of rottenness? Because each nation has its own history of thieving and lies and broken faith, therefore there can only flourish international suspicion and jealousy, and international moral shame becomes anemic to a degree of ludicrousness. The nation's bagpipe of righteous indignation has so often changed its tune according to the variation of time and to the altered groupings of the alliances of diplomacy, that it can be enjoyed with amusement as the variety performance of the political music hall. I am just coming from my visit to Japan, where I exhorted this young nation to take its stand upon the higher ideals of humanity and never to follow the West in its acceptance of the organised selfishness of nationalism as its religion, never to gloat upon the feebleness of its neighbours, never to be unscrupulous in its behaviour to the weak, where it can be gloriously mean with impunity while turning its right cheek of brighter humanity for the kiss of admiration to those who have the power to deal it a blow. Some of the newspapers praise my utterances for their poetical qualities, while adding with a leer that it was the poetry of a defeated people. I felt they were right. Japan had been taught in a modern school the lesson how to become powerful. The schooling is done, and she must enjoy the fruits of her lessons. The West, in the voice of her thundering cannon, had said at the door of Japan, "Let there be a nation," and there was a nation. And now that it has come into existence, why do you not feel in your heart of hearts a pure feeling of gladness and say that it is good? Why is it that I saw in an English paper an expression of bitterness at Japan's boasting of her superiority of civilization, the thing that the British, along with other nations, has been carrying on for ages without blushing? Because the idealism of selfishness must keep itself drunk with a continual dose of self-laudation. But the same vices which seem so natural and innocuous in its own life make it surprised and angry at their unpleasantness when seen in your other nations. Therefore, when you see the Japanese nation created in your own image, launched in its career of national boastfulness, you shake your head and say that it is not good. Has it not been one of the causes that raised the cry on these shores for preparedness to meet one more power of evil with a greater power of injury? Japan protests that she has her Bushido, that she can never be treacherous to America, to whom she owes her gratitude. But you find it difficult to believe her. For the wisdom of the nation is not in its faith in humanity, but in its complete distrust. You say to yourself that it is not with Japan of the Bushido, the Japan of the moral ideals that you have to deal. It is with the abstraction of the popular selfishness. It is with the nation. And nation can only trust nation where their interests coalesce, or at least do not conflict. In fact, your instinct tells you that the advent of another people into the arena of nationality makes another addition to the evil which contradicts all that is highest in man and proves by its success that unscrupulousness is the way to prosperity, and goodness is good for the weak, and God is the only remaining consolation of the defeated. Yes, this is the logic of the nation, and it will never heed the voice of truth and goodness. It will go on in its ring dance of moral corruption, linking steel upon steel and machine unto machine, trampling under its tread all the sweet flowers of simple faith and the living ideals of man. But we delude ourselves into thinking that humanity in the modern days is more to the front than ever before. The reason for this self-delusion is because man is served with the necessaries of life in greater profusion, and his physical ills are being alleviated with more efficacy. But the chief part of this is done not by moral sacrifice, but by intellectual power. In quantity it is great, but it springs from the surface and spreads over the surface. Knowledge and efficiency are powerful in their outward effect, but they are the servants of man, not man himself. Their service is like the service in a hotel where it is elaborate, but the host is absent. It is more convenient than hospitable. Therefore, we must not forget that the scientific organizations, vastly spreading in all directions, are strengthening our power, but not our humanity. With the growth of power, the cult of the self-worship of the nation grows in ascendancy, and the individual willingly allows the nation to take donkey rides upon his back. And there happens the anomaly which must have its disastrous effects, that the individual worships with all sacrifices a God which is morally much inferior to himself. This could never have been possible if the God had been as real as the individual. Let me give an illustration of this point. In some parts of India, it has been enjoined as an act of great piety for a widow to go without food and water on a particular day every fortnight. This often leads to cruelty, unmeaning and inhuman. And yet men are not by nature cruel to such a degree. But this piety, being a mere unreal abstraction, completely deadens the moral sense of the individual. Just as the man who would not hurt an animal unnecessarily would cause horrible suffering to a large number of innocent creatures when he drugs his feelings with the abstract idea of sport. Because these ideas are the creations of our intellect, because they are logical classifications, therefore they can so easily hide in their midst the personal man. And the idea of the nation is one of the most powerful anesthetics that man has invented. Under the influence of its fumes, the whole people can carry out its systematic program of the most virulent self-seeking without being in the least aware of its moral perversion. In fact, feeling dangerously resentful if it is pointed out. But can this go on indefinitely? Continually producing barrenness of moral insensibility upon a large tract of our living nature? Can it escape its nemesis forever? Has this giant power of mechanical organisation no limit in this world against which it may shatter itself all the more completely because of its terrible strength and velocity? Do you believe that evil can be permanently kept in check by competition with evil, and that conference of prudence can keep the devil chained in its makeshift cage of mutual agreement. This European war of nations is the war of retribution. Man, the person, must protest for his very life against the heaping up of things where there should be the heart, and systems and policies where there should flow living human relationship. The time has come when, for the sake of the whole outraged world, Europe should fully know in her own person the terrible absurdity of the thing called the nation. The nation has thriven long upon mutilated humanity. Men, the fairest creations of God, came out of the national manufactory in huge numbers as war-making and money-making puppets, ludicrously vain of their pitiful perfection of mechanism. Human society grew more and more into a marionette show of politicians, soldiers, manufacturers and bureaucrats, pulled by wire arrangements of wonderful efficiency. But the apotheosis of selfishness can never make its interminable breed of hatred and greed, fear and hypocrisy, suspicion and tyranny an end in themselves. These monsters grow into huge shapes, but never into harmony, and this nation may grow to an unimaginable corpulence, not of a living body, but of steel and steam and office buildings, till its deformity can contain no longer its ugly voluminousness, till it begins to crack and gape, breathe gas and fire and gasps, and its death rattles sound in cannon roars. In this war the death throes of the nation have commenced. Suddenly all its mechanism going mad, it has begun the dance of the Furies, shattering its own limbs, scattering them into the dust. It is the fifth act of the tragedy of the unreal. Those who have any faith in man cannot but fervently hope that the tyranny of the nation will not be restored to all its former teeth and claws, to its far-reaching iron arms and its immense inner cavity, or stomach and no heart, that man will have his new birth in the freedom of his individuality, from the enveloping vagueness of abstraction. The veil has been raised, and in this frightful war, the West has stood face to face with her own creation, to which she had offered her soul. She must know what it truly is. She had never let herself suspect what slow decay and decomposition were secretly going on in her moral nature, which often broke out in doctrines of scepticism, but still oftener and in still more dangerously subtle manner showed itself in her unconsciousness of the mutilation and insult that she had been inflicting upon a vast part of the world. Now she must know the truth nearer home. And then there will come from her own children those who will break themselves free from the slavery of this illusion, this perversion of brotherhood founded upon self-seeking, those who will own themselves as God's children and as no bond slaves of machinery, which turns souls into commodities and life into compartments, which with its iron claws scratches out the heart of the world and knows not what it has done. And we of no nations of the world, whose heads have been bowed to the dust, will know that his dust is more sacred than the bricks which build the pride of power. For this dust is fertile of life and of beauty and worship. We shall thank God that we were made to wait in silence through the night of despair, had to bear the insult of the proud and the strong man's burden. Yet all through it, though our hearts quaked with doubt and fear, never could we blindly believe in the salvation which machinery offered to man. But we held fast to our trust in God and the truth of the human soul. And we can still cherish the hope that when power becomes ashamed to occupy its throne and is ready to make way for love, when the morning comes for cleansing the blood-stained steps of the nation along the high road of humanity, we shall be called upon to bring our own vessel of sacred water, the water of worship, to sweeten the history of man into purity, and with its sprinkling make the trampled dust of the centuries blessed with fruitfulness. Well, thanks for listening. And Isaiah Berlin is one of the great political philosophers of the 20th century who largely wrote in the essay form. He was a great conversationalist. Some people have one big idea and others know a little bit about many things. And Isaiah Berlin was very much the person who knew a little bit about many things and contributed wonderful insights on many issues. And one of his essays from the book The Sense of Reality, which I'll be reading another essay in next week's Monday reading, is indeed Rabindranath Tagore and nationality. And at the end of that essay, he provides a very touching tribute to the thinking of Rabindranath Tagore. He writes of many people who seek to galvanise the resentments, I guess, of the experience of colonial rule towards a nationalist ideal. And he writes, "It is easier to preach passionately to a country that it should adopt some vast revolutionary ideology and centralise and simplify and subordinate everything to a single goal or a single man or a single party. It is not difficult to call for a return to the past, to tell men to turn their backs on foreign devils, to live solely on one's own resources, proud, independent, unconcerned. India has heard such voices. Tagore understood this, paid tribute to this, and resisted it. He seems to me, during his long and marvellously fruitful life, absorbed in concerns more creative than social or political activity, to have aimed to make only what was beautiful and to say only what was true. This entailed self-discipline and exceptional patience and integrity. I can understand well that a country, and especially a great country with a rich past and perhaps an even richer future, can justly feel proud of one of the rarest of all the gifts of nature, a poet of genius, who even in moments of acute crisis, when he spoke to and for his countrymen, and they craved not for mere reason, but for signs and miracles, did not yield, but unswervingly told them only what he saw, only the truth. I hope that is a very fine ending to my two special readings of Rabindranath Tagore's essays, The Crisis of Civilization and Nationalism in the West. And I do hope you appreciate and maybe check out some of these essays yourself and think about the ways in which we can perhaps imagine our futures and our histories a little bit separately from the idea of the nation. And if you'd like to explore that further, why don't you go to my Substack at jeffrich.substack.com, and you'll be able to read my upcoming essay on exactly that topic. Thanks for listening, and why not check out this video right here next.